I'm sitting down with Arvind Subramanian, leading economist, fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the Center for Global Development. His book is called Eclipse, Living in the Shadow of China's Economic Dominance. And here you see President Obama bowing to the Chinese leader. Is it really dominating? I mean, many in the U.S. would say that the U.S. is still the richest country in the world. It is the most powerful economy.
At the moment, China's GDP, for example, is smaller than that of the United States. That's true. But if you measure it in terms of purchasing power, it's as big as the United States, one. Second, China is already the world's largest trader. Three, China is a big net creditor to the world. It finances the US, and the US is a debtor. So it's this combination of the size of the economy, the fact it's a big trader, and the fact that it's a creditor confers on it a lot of power. That's today. And over the next 10, 15 years, all these numbers are going to go in China's favor, so that China is going to become an even bigger economy than the US, an even bigger trader than the US, and continue to be, financing the US. So that combination is what is making China very dominant. Let me give you one example, just one example. So take the fact that China, finances the US, right? Or it has so much cash, $3.3 trillion worth of cash. If Europe gets into trouble now, which could still happen, which country in the world has the ability to bail out Europe? Not the United States, China, because there's $3 trillion. And when it has that power or that ability, it can always exercise power.
What could be political ramifications of that as far as crucial foreign policy issues? For example, over Syria, will the U.S. pay more attention to what China thinks about certain issues?
Well, take Iran, for example. I think, the U.S. wants China to be on its side. And, if China were to take North Korea, for example, it's a great example, if China were on the side of the U.S., things would be so much easier. But the fact that China has an independent view on North Korea makes American dealings with North Korea that much more difficult. In fact, in my book, I begin my book with a kind of fantasy scenario where I say that 10 years from now, if the United States gets into so much economic trouble, right, that it will have to borrow money, and if only China has the money to provide the US, China might say, well, we don't like your military presence in the Pacific, your naval presence, and you have to, get rid of that. So economic power can always be leveraged for political and foreign policy objectives. The good thing is that one of the reasons not to get over kind of anxious about this is that it is a mutually dependent relationship, So one country doesn't want to inflict too much damage on the other because it backfires on yourself. But that being said, there are areas where, some countries, China has more power, and it could use that to end. I mean, like, for example, as I said, or North Korea or Iran, or, the fact that it has so much financial power and economic power can always be used for political ends.
But isn't that a good thing in a sense that it restores some kind of a balance when there is not just one kid on the block ruling everything, but there is the kid consulting with everyone else because it is dependent on others?
That's a good point. But there are, there can be two views on this, right? One view is that after World War II, the US was able to determine how the global economic system would function, right? And broadly, it had a liberal view, there should be more free flow of goods and services and so on, which everyone benefited from. And the country that benefited most from that was China. The fact that markets were open, that's China. So some would say that if you have one big good guy, maybe it's better than having multiple guys who kind of can't agree on anything. But you can take two views on that.
That's a very unilateral world. I mean, that one good guy can actually turn into a bad guy at some point.
True, that's a risk, and that's exactly. But the flip side with having multiple, sources of power is that you can also get paralysis in decision making. So whether cooperation is easier with, one hegemon who's broadly okay, or with multiple, sources of power, multiple veto points, making cooperation more difficult, more easy, is an open question. You can argue it both ways.
But I would argue for multiple powers. Because when we're talking about a unilateral approach, we have an example of that, Iraq.
True, absolutely. I agree. That's a very good point.
Nobody was there to stop it.
Exactly. So I think the point so the very good point that you make is that, if you have, a one power, even if they can sometimes, do things unilaterally which are bad objectives, there's no one to check them.
The U.S. is the world's biggest debtor, and it seems the main way they address the gigantic debt problem is the money printing machine. Has money printing become America's main business?
Well, I think yes and no. I think it's, on the one hand, they have printed a lot of money in the last, let's say, 3-4 years, But I think they would argue, with some, I think, fairness, that that's what you needed to get this economy back when it went into, the kind of great recession after the crisis.
You wrote a lot about China keeping their currency deliberately undervalued to preserve their competitive advantage. The U.S. is terribly unhappy about that.
Yeah.
But the U.S., on the other hand, is also playing with their currency, constantly printing money that they don't have to pay off their debt and all that. Don't you see a hint of hypocrisy when the U.S. is bashing China over their currency policy, but at the same time playing with their own currency in a way that is not necessarily fair?
Well, I would say that, I think there is a parallel, but I think the parallel is overdone. The funny thing is the following, that even though the U.S. has been printing a lot of money, in the last 2 to 3 years after the crisis, the dollar has not weakened, it has become stronger. So you print a lot of money. If you really wanted to make your currency cheap and competitive, you would print a lot of money. But because the rest of the world still has so much confidence in the dollar, when there's a crisis, they all come to dollars and the dollar becomes strong. So the effect of all this printing money has not been to make the currency cheaper. In a way, that China's policies has made the Chinese currency cheaper.
What you've been talking about is basically the world's confidence in U.S. dollar, and dollar dominance allows the U.S. to live beyond its means, essentially.
To some extent, yeah.
How long can it last?
Well, the thing is that it cannot last indefinitely. Because in my book, I argue that because of the rise of China and the fact that the Chinese economy is becoming so strong, it's a creditor, big trader, gradually over time, the Chinese currency will start to become like, kind of displace the dollar, because people will have more confidence in the Chinese currency than in the American currency. That's going to be a gradual process. And, but at some point it could start to happen rapidly. And at that point, the US no longer has the ability to live beyond its means, like you said, because the dollar is dominant. But that's going to happen over the next 10, 15 years.
The IMF has traditionally been dominated by Europe and the United States. It was set up that way. And here you have this massive debt crisis in Eurozone countries, and you have the Eurozone countries asking the non-Eurozone countries to contribute more resources to the IMF to help them out. Do you think this current crisis could change the way the IMF works, sort of shift the centers of power?
It's a very good question. I think to some extent it's happening already. It's happening already because, the formal voting is still very much biased, as you said, in favor of Europe and the United States. But the more more Europe gets into trouble, the more it will need money from the outside. Frankly, borrowers don't have power, creditors call the shots. And at that stage, when Europe starts weakening and it needs money from the outside, and if only China and Russia and Brazil have the money to provide it, they will ask for, changing the system. They will have more power. We'll say, well, if you don't do these things, we don't give you the money. So when you become weak, it's inevitable that power shifts away from you. And that's what the European crisis is actually galvanizing, changes in the international institutions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.